Ladies and gentlemen, there is no pianist with a more legendary status than Franz Liszt. For us, Liszt stands equal to the absolute pinnacle of piano playing. When students wake up in the morning, they get an energy boost just by thinking of Franz Liszt. That name alone gets them through the day with 8 or 10 hours of practice, because that's the aim. He's the goal. He is everything we want to be as a pianist or musician. When you say to a living pianist, to every pianist today, that his or her technique is not on par with that of Franz Liszt, there will be no one that's offended. Yet, nobody of you watching this video has ever heard Franz Liszt playing. But that's gonna change today, because in this video, for the very first time in history, I'm gonna show you the real technical power of Franz Liszt. If you think that watching the top virtuoso players today on stage gives a pretty good image of what this 19th century legendary pianist could do, you're dead wrong. Stay tuned, because this story will have two very unexpected twists, and even if you watch this channel for a longer time, you won't see these twists coming. There we go. And in order to demonstrate to you what Liszt was really capable of when we was sitting down at this piano, the technical power, the agility, the virtuosity, we're going to take a little bit of an unusual path. We're going to focus on the transcriptions that he made of Beethoven's symphonies. These are legendary pieces, also among the works that Liszt wrote, today considered to be among the most difficult repertoire ever written, even in the context of Liszt's own repertoire, his own works, his own etudes even. And since Liszt is not around anymore to demonstrate what we would like him to demonstrate, I'm going to use the still today very famous recording that Cyprian Katsaris made of the Beethoven Liszt transcriptions of the symphonies. He also has almost a legendary status because of these recordings. And by the way, another recording that is about to get legendary status are the recordings that we made of Beethoven's entire symphony, 9 symphonies and whole beat, on a beautiful fortepiano together with my colleague Alberto Sanna in the mind-blowing transcriptions of Karl Czerny. Guess who Liszt's teacher was? Exactly. And so 500 boxes with 10 CDs. The 9 symphonies in 10 CDs are about to arrive either this week or next week. I'm recording this video to 27th of May 2024. And if you order this box within the coming week or 2 weeks, but before we are going to ship, and you use the code FIRST SHIPPING, you will get a 20% discount. And on top of that, also all of you who ordered the box before or supported us on Kickstarter, you will get access to the entire set of downloadable FLAC files and streaming options provided by Bandcamp. And by the way, all the recordings on the website until that moment are discounted 20%. Go ahead and check it out. But back to Katsaris. There is an interview recently published where he talked about these transcriptions, about the recordings of these transcriptions, in which he said, of course, they are very difficult. I myself worked for 10 years on my Teldec recordings from the 1980s. And so before anyone thinks that these transcriptions are just of moderate difficulty, I have to ask you the question, when was the last time you practiced 10 years for, in this case, a series of pieces? That's almost insane. That these symphonic transcriptions are extremely difficult is also shown by the tempi that Katsaris took after 10 years of practicing. Let's not forget that. So if we focus, for instance, on the 8th symphony, we see that Katsaris plays 25% slower in the first movement, 18% slower in the second movement, 16% slower in the third movement, and the last movement, the Allegro Vivace, he has a tempo of 56-63. That's about 70% of the metronome mark indicated by Beethoven and by Liszt, by the way, which is 30% slower than this movement should be performed in. And before you think that Katsaris is just an amateur, I'm joking, but before you think like, yeah, we could actually play it faster if we want, I share with you a short fragment of his performance, and I have to honestly admit, when I first heard that fragment, I was shocked. It has a kind of speed, it has a kind of clarity, it has a kind of virtuosity that for me is unparalleled. Here it is. Now the question comes, of course, whether Liszt would play this piece in the indicated 84, focusing on the last movement. You could ask the question if these transcriptions were supposed to be played at the indicated tempo. Well, there are several arguments in favor of that. To begin with, like Liszt published Beethoven's metronome marks for the symphonies. You could say he just did it as a reference. That would be like very strange in a way. He would publish the metronome mark with the only reason not to follow it. Also, you could make the argument, if you make a transcription of an orchestral piece, that means you want the orchestral music to sound as close as possible on the piano, and especially in the case of Czerny and Liszt, we have letters from Liszt in which he literally said that his goal was to get as much of the orchestral effects on the piano. And tempo is just very important. His teacher Karel Czerny very famously said, any musical piece produces its proper effect only when it's played in the exact degree of movement prescribed by its author. And any even inconsiderable deviation from that time, whether as to quickness or slowness, will often totally destroy the sense, the beauty and the intelligibility of the piece. Those are not my words, those are the words of Karel Czerny. And there is no reason to believe that Liszt suddenly would deviate from this idea. But also his colleague Thalberg, let's not forget about his colleague Thalberg. He was one of the only challengers to Liszt. Thalberg was also famous for transcriptions, very virtuosic transcriptions. And in his famous bundle, L'Art du Chant appliqué au piano, so the transcriptions of songs on the piano, which are extremely difficult, maybe even more difficult than the Beethoven transcriptions made by Liszt. In the preface, he says this about tempo. Les mouvements faisant partie intégrante du caractère et de l'esprit d'une composition musicale, nos transcriptions devront être exécutées dans ceux que nous avons indiqués au métronome, sauf les retardando ou les accélérando. So, freely translated, the tempi are integral part of the character and the spirit of the musical compositions. And so the transcriptions we have made must be played in the tempi we have indicated at the beginning. Of course, except the ritardando and the accelerando, and those are indicated. So again, I'm stressing this point of tempo for the simple reason we have to come to an agreement on the fact that when Liszt marked the last movement of the 8th Symphony in 84, that he really meant this transcription to be played in 84. It's really important. I'm saying this because Katsaris, after 10 years of practicing, only reached 70% of that. And before we continue, there's also this very interesting remark made by Johannes Brahms to Clara Schumann. The moment that Clara Schumann is metronomizing the works of her husband, then he says about the metronomization of the orchestral works something very interesting. We have already extensively discussed the proposed metronome marks, so you still want to do it? Keep in mind that one cannot arrange choir and orchestral works solely for this purpose. And on the piano, now it comes, due to its lighter sound, everything is played decidedly more lively, faster, and also easier to follow in tempo. Of course, he's not commenting on the Liszt transcriptions made of the Beethoven symphonies, but he is commenting on transcriptions or reductions in general. Sitting at the piano, he says, you have the tendency to more easily go faster. That's the complete opposite of what we just experienced with Katsaris. He played much slower, and it's not only the 8th Symphony. He plays almost all the movements of all the symphonies slower to much slower compared to the metronome mark. So how are we supposed to understand this? For us, orchestral music is in tempo here, and piano reductions can only be here. For Brahms, it was the opposite. We tried to figure out what's going on later. For now, there is no escape in the understanding that in the 19th century, the intention of the reduction, of the piano reduction, is to play the piece as closely as possible to the original intention of the composer who composed it for orchestra. There's so much evidence pointing to that fact that it's useless to not stick to that point of departure. And it is a point of departure because what we're going to do now is take the fragment of the 8th Symphony last movement played by Katsaris, and we're going to use digital techniques in order to give you an impression what 84, so the literal tempo for the last movement of the 8th Symphony in Liszt transcription, sounds like. In other words, this is how Liszt played his transcription of this Beethoven symphony. For modern musicology, this is the end of the story. We just accept that Liszt played at the beginning of this piece, and every time you have triplets, 17 notes a second. We can no longer do that on any type of piano, but we simply accept it as a fact. And I'm not saying this lightly, and you shouldn't take this statement lightly either. The 17 notes per second are the foundation on which our entire musical view, also musicological view on our musical past, is based. We have to accept that Liszt was able to play this easily in order to stick to the narrative that metronome marks in those days were read as we read them today, meaning single beat. But that's not the end of the story. I promised you some mind-blowing twists, and if you had the attention span to make it thus far into the video, well, then sit back and pay attention, because the most intriguing part of the story has yet to come. We just read an excerpt from an interview by Katsaris in which he said that he practiced 10 years. He prepared 10 years. He needed 10 years in order to record these symphonies, transcriptions by Liszt. That becomes almost painful when we read an 1863 letter by Franz Liszt to his publisher. I have tried not to neglect to take into account the relative facility of execution, such as this arrangement of Beethoven's symphonies actually is. The pupils of the first class in the conservatories will be able to play them off fairly well on reading them at sight. Our story now becomes a little bit uneasy. So we see at one hand our top virtuoso guy, Katsaris, practicing 10 years to achieve something that's 30% too slow. And on the other hand, Liszt writing to his publisher saying, I made these transcriptions so that first year's conservatory students can sight read them. But how do you connect these two worlds? Why is Katsaris not able to do what first-year conservatory students were able to do in 1863? And before you say, yeah, but Katsaris could speed this up like easily. No. Go back and listen to the fragment I shared of his recording. It's mind-blowing. 99.9% of you watching right now will never, ever in his entire life come even close to what Katsaris does there. So he is giving the best that humanity today has to offer. And yet there we have something so factually true. Liszt saying, I wrote these pieces, I made these transcriptions to be sight-readable, not by the top virtuosos of today, but by the first year's conservatory students in 1863. And so it's not enough to come to a conclusion that Liszt would outperform all of us, literally all of us, with the fingers in his nose, apparently, based upon the outcome of modern musicology, because that it is. We take the metronome mark, we read it as we do today, that's the outcome. 10 years practice for Katsaris, he doesn't even come to the minimum standards like reaching the tempo. But for Liszt, it's like even not, it's below sight reading. It's sight readable for first year's conservatory students. Can we agree that there is something not okay here, that there is something we have to solve? But it's not the end of the story. There's another twist. And if you thought the previous twist was like mind-blowing, this one will really blow you from your chair. I will add something that we here internally call the Fink doctrine. And what is a Fink doctrine? Gottfried Wilhelm Fink was a famous publisher of music critiques. He published in 1839 a critique in the Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung, in which he reproached the musicians of that time to murder the music of Mozart and to kill actually all music of the past. That Fink story that article is very, very important because it goes into detail in describing the new trends already in 1839 that were ongoing for years. So the trend started much earlier and probably already in Beethoven's time, where musicians, for all kinds of reasons, started to speed up music so much. Virtuosity, speed was in the center of everything. And they not only created new music to demonstrate their agility and virtuosity and dexterity, they also used music from the past. That's why Fink wrote this article. I'm not quoting him fully. I made a video a few years back on this article, so I will link it in the description box. You can check it out if you want. But Fink was not the only one. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of similar quotes in that time. Just to quote a few, Clara Schumann even was criticized on stage. As for the finale, it's not a question here of personal dissatisfaction, but of the outrageous conduct of an irresponsible artist. Frau Schumann altered the prescribed allegretto into a prestissimo that even her amazingly agile fingers were unable to execute. The precipitous rushing over of the runs, as in that newly discovered Beethoven prestissimo, is simply the deplorable result of an irresistible desire on the part of today's whole musical world to take every tempo faster than the composer and the simplest laws of nature, art and reason would have them. That's 1856 Clara Schumann. There is a difference in the Clara Schumann on stage and the Clara Schumann in the study room, but that's for an entire other chapter. But also someone like Moscheles, he wrote, and somewhere in the 60s, he went to a concert and he wrote like, it's played impeccably, and yet to my mind the tempi of the first and the last movement, I believe it was a Mozart symphony, were too fast. Is it because I'm older and my blood is circulating more slowly, or is it that the others are following a new direction where everything is carried to extremes? That's the same Moscheles who gave metronome marks to Beethoven keyboard works, on which Clive Brown, one of the leading musicologists of today, write in a Berenreiter edition of the violin sonatas like, it's incomprehensible to me, I'm quoting freely. Moscheles writes that he is actually refraining from the very fast tempi that virtuosos of his day are taking to play the Beethoven works in. He's refraining from that. He's giving more moderate tempi as he remembered them by Beethoven or by Beethoven students. And Clive Brown says it's incomprehensible. How can it be? Because those tempi are among the fastest ever produced. So again, there you see this dilemma. Moshe is saying, I'm giving tempi that actually are much slower compared to the tempi that musicians today take for playing Beethoven. And today we would look at these metronome marks and say, well, how did these people actually play faster than these already impossibly fast metronome marks? And the same is true for the story that we are in right now. We have seen Katsaris practicing 10 years in order to achieve something that is 30% too slow compared to the standards of Liszt. The standards of Liszt were that this should have been possible for first year's conservatory students. But we add now the Fink doctrine on top of that. We know for a fact that especially in the second half of the 19th century, but that trend already started in the first half of the 19th century, that musicians played much faster compared to the original authentic tempi. Well, the authentic tempo for the 8th symphony we have. That's 84 for the last movement, given by Beethoven himself. We have seen what the result is when we speed Katsaris 30% too slow, recording up to 84 single beat tempo. This leads to a 70 note per second execution that nobody today can do. Nobody. 70 notes per second is out of the question. And now we come to this Fink doctrine, we have to assume, based on facts, it's not me who's saying that, based on facts, that in those days, in the 1860s, exactly the time where Liszt wrote this letter to his publisher, that professional musicians, people that were on stage, played much faster compared to the published metronome marks, because those are the tempi of the old days. And so, if you read that article published by Fink, then you realize he's not talking about 5%. He's not talking about 10%. He's talking about an increase in speed that probably is close to double. We have other sources that confirm that. And by the way, the book that we're still working on very hard, promise you that will contain dozens of such sources. And I will make a video very shortly in which I can also show you some sources that speak about that, the fact that musicians on stage played pieces double in the tempo that actually they were supposed to be played in. But here in this case, if I add 30% to this single beat tempo, so the modern reading of the metronome tempo that we just heard, I don't think I'm exaggerating. 30% would, I think, still not be in a range to trigger someone like Fink to write an article in which he accused the musicians, the conductors of his time, his colleagues, to be barbaric in their performances. But let's just stick to 30%. And while you're listening, you have to realize that the tempo you're hearing, it will be ridiculous. You will be laughing, you will be rolling over the floor. It's like it has a great aspect of humor in it. Actually, all of it has a great aspect of humor in it. But you have to realize that this is a foundation of modern musicology in order to stick to a single beat interpretation of historical metronome marks. There is no other way to see it. Either we accept to have been a reality in the 19th century what you're going to hear, or we reject it, and then we find a solution. And of course, we have a solution. But before we go there, listen to the effect of the single beat tempo of the last movement of the 8th Symphony plus 30%. And so my question to you is now, we can debate forever whether a source points to whole beat or not. And whole beat, obviously, if you're watching this and you're new, is the practice, the metronome practice that we think, we know for sure actually, was used in the 19th century primarily. Every beat consists out of two ticks. It's that simple. It's the up-down, it's the tactus, it's the arsystasis. It's like how physicists today still count pendulum strokes. But we debate often the fact, here on this channel, yeah, but I see this sentence and I see that sentence and we have this source, and of course it's impossible for me in this framework, like I'm talking to a camera, I'm talking to you, but there is no response. I cannot bring you everything. I have to focus on one aspect. But videos like this, they do one thing. I hope they do one thing. It's they open your mind for one thing only. It's seeing the metronomic problem. And in this case, it's pretty extreme. Although we can take other pieces, and applying the Fink doctrine brings everything in a space where there is no discussion anymore. That this is not a reality that has existed. Everybody will agree on that. And so then the question comes, once you see that problem, once you see there is an enormous problem there, based off the vision we have on reading the metronome marks of the past. It's not dogmatic, it's not denying anything, it's just a fact. This is untenable. We have to change that. We have to look for another solution. And in case of this mechanical pendulum, we can either say tick, 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 or we can say tick and tick and tick. There is no other way of reading the metronome. is either this single beat modern musicology standpoint, or we go to the old pendulum physics, whatever you want to call it, way of using that device. It's 1 and 2 and all the problems are solved. Yes, music will become slower. Some pieces, as I've demonstrated in the past, last videos even, we still play in whole beat and we like it. The pieces that haven't changed, the Opus 10 number 3 by Chopin, the Opus 27 number 2 by Chopin. But there are other pieces as well, and we would not want to change them for a million years, and that has a reason, because if you go back in this whole beat tempo and you just open your mind a little bit, you accept it and you try to play it and you try to enjoy it. Once you enjoy it, you don't want to go back. There is not only the logic of solving all technical problems, but suddenly you hear rhythmical subdivision, rhythmical diversification. You hear harmonic changes, harmonic shifts. You hear like accents that you've never heard before. You hear this timeline of a composition. In the case of our Beethoven symphonies, it was like one of the magic discoveries for both Alberto and me. We have even a 26-hour podcast that you get for free when you order the full Beethoven experience. Go and check out the link. Also, that is with 20% discount in the coming weeks. Well, in that podcast, you hear us talk about this timeline and how Beethoven is using that timeline in order to, guide you in the wrong direction and bring you back. And all of that disappears when you speed up the music so much. That's why Fink used the term barbaric. If you're on our side, and not side in a political sense, but in the whole beats perspective, and you enjoy music like that, you open yourself to enjoy music like that, you will have the same feeling when you go back to modern performances that are even slower than the projected single beat metronome marks. You will say, like, how is it possible nobody else can see it? But the case we focused on today, the last movement of the 8th Symphony, Katsaris, Liszt, the letter, the single beat tempo, that's actually already enough. And finally, be part of our Beethoven journey, of our Beethoven project, of our tempo project, and put your name on the list of that first shipment of the Beethoven boxes, because that will be a legendary shipment. The recording probably already is legendary, even if I'm saying it myself. Thanks for watching. We see each other soon again. Bye.